Andrea and I had a conversations actually on Substack and realized that there's like I think our work is quite different in many ways, Andrea, and yet there's some really
Hmm.
interesting crossovers. And one of those crossovers is in this area of embodiment and cognition and how embodied cognition actually works. You've written a book about the VW Beetle, right? So, which is, and that was a really cool thing to see. Where I was like, wow, okay, this is going to be
Was
really my
anyone
field.
expecting that?
Yeah, well, I was not. I was like, okay, well, how do? But fascinatingly, there is so much. A lot of what I've been certainly working on this documentary Crossroads, which has been taking up most of my headspace for the last few months, has been about this idea of um, the movement from abstraction back into embodiment, or vice versa, and how our systems and how our whole lives and relationships really kind of maybe echo this kind of this movement of how much are we actually in something, feeling it, touching it, in it, whether that's a policy, a system, a relationship, um, a conversation about politics, and how much are we abstracted really far away from it? Like, well, that's most of the communication on the internet really is that. And so similarly with our economic systems, how, the New York Stock Exchange, I believe, was bought by its own derivative a few years ago, which is bad. Abstractions upon abstractions upon abstractions. And so there's something very
Hmm.
interesting for me about the question between um, abstraction and embodiment and movement, which is something that your research covers a lot as well, which is something I hadn't, like mobility, movement, like it's something I hadn't really considered a whole bunch. So maybe you could start us off with a bit of context about your work and why mobility? Why should we be focusing on mobility?
Oh, well, my work is a little bit hard to put into a sentence, but I do think the through line is movement, and movement as a form of cognition, even. Or, this gets tricky because I don't want to say they're the same thing, but I do want to say they're the same process. And I've written a lot about cars, as you just mentioned, which kind of shocks people because I have degrees in philosophy and neuroscience and all of this. But for me, it's actually very connected because, and it has to do with what you were saying about the abstraction, because I think of locomotion and mind and cognition as a continuous process. And those words mean different things when we're assessing that process. But then we create these tools to try to extend that or help us, and I think that's the abstraction, where the abstraction begins, maybe, that you were talking about. Because, even a car, I did write about cars, but it's actually more of a philosophical book. It's actually trying to tell the story of how something like the Volkswagen Beetle could be a sign, sorry, my dog is here, could be a sign of hippie movement, which is how I knew it. And then, but it had started with this past in Hitler's Germany. Hitler actually is the reason that car was born. So I was thinking, when you think of a car, for example, or any form of transportation, it's actually extending what's possible for us in terms of our movement, but that's also an extension of what's possible for our mind and for our cognition and for our social engagement, for our participatory sense making, which is, a word I use a lot. So, I can go into all these little like nested levels of this, but I think the big picture is that idea of thinking, which is actually very radical, to understand that cognition and locomotion are continuous, that these aren't separate things, even though we need separate sort of words to assess them. That's something that the hippocampus helps me to do. But then just zooming out and understanding, okay, we're moving through the world, we're making our way in all these different levels, mental landscapes, virtual landscapes, physical landscapes, and we're creating technologies and tools to kind of extend that, which means making more possible, and that could be more connections. But it can also be more abstraction in the way that you said, such that we, instead of literally sort of connecting like a car might have connected us, I could travel to you and visit you, our families could visit. Now maybe we just do it over the internet, which is still technology, but it's an abstraction, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots I want to dive in that. In particular, this idea of what we're doing right now on Substack, on Zoom, in the sense that we are somewhat traveling to one another, but we're absolutely
Mhm.
not because we're all seated, here in our respective chairs and couches and whatever it might be. But there is some sense of movement. And when I play a video game, there's also some sense that I'm moving somewhere. And I want to go way back into the past, and I want to imagine perhaps our hunter-gatherer ancestors, and just maybe get your thoughts on like the kind of movement in their lives, which might have been a lot of walking and perhaps occasionally running and hunting. And was it like, I guess my question is, was it all there already, or are we now experiencing some forms of movement that if I went back 40,000 years ago and tried to explain it to someone, they just wouldn't get, or we're just working with the same machinery. So, it's kind of all the same thing.
Well, I think we have to separate these things a little bit because mind and movement, this is an activity. I think of mind as an activity. We call it a noun. We name things nouns and we use nouns to try to talk and communicate and understand one another. But the activity of mind is a verb always. It's cognition is a verb for me, just as locomotion is a verb, even though we can use it as a noun. And yes, I think there's differences in, especially in the terms of technology. I mean, if we go all the way back to hunter-gatherers and walking, then there were technologies created to make that process better, and they extended what was possible for those people in those situations. And all of those things, of course, sort of shaped those social relationships. And that, for me, is also shaping not necessarily some kind of a hierarchy of how much intelligence they can have or how much cognition they can have. I don't really see it like that. I try to see it more complex and multiplicities of different ways that we can think and different sorts of intelligences, holding paradox. Um, and so when I look into the past, I don't necessarily see it as some kind of line where, okay, we were walking then and we were more connected with our bodies, and then now we're smarter, but we're just more disconnected. I think there's too many layers going on in all of that. But I guess what I would say is that we've probably done something where we've started to mistake the map or the technology for the cognition or for the process in a way that we could have done with walking, because I mean, I think walking is continuous with what we think of as cognition, but I don't think the computer is. And I think this gets very tricky in modern times of thinking that technology itself can do this sort of process of cognition in the way I mean it, which is about connection, about social participation, about creating new possibilities of paths. And technology helps us open those paths, but it's very easy to confuse that in a way that probably wasn't true for our ancestors. They probably weren't confusing the tools they were using with the actual kind of meaning in their lives and the way that they connected with those around them in the same way. Now we can easily confuse real people with their avatar, for example, or with their image on the screen. There's this idea of optics that I talk about a lot, where I think we've gotten kind of caught up in the complexity of this whole world of representations and images and tools that we built to extend our connection. But now we've somehow taken those as what we're connecting to. I think I'm connecting to your Facebook image. I mean, Facebook is like, you said to go back in the past, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm trying to look at your life through your representations, your pictures of that life, and connect them to the representations of mine. That feels different to me than, where you started with the walking. But I don't necessarily see the process as different in terms of that our bodies are moving through different spaces. Even when we were hunters and gatherers, we were moving through thought space, and we were moving through physical space, and we were moving through relational space, the way we have relationships together. I don't think that's changed. The way we do it, and that we can confuse our tools for one another, feels different to me, and something actually that's kind of needs to be urgently addressed right now, especially in terms of the way that optics is sort of taken over what we think of as meaningful or successful or even reality sometimes.
Yeah, there's so much in there I want to pick up on. Before I
Hmm.
jump into it, though, I want to just, for anyone who's just tuning in, or for anyone who might be new to this idea that the way we move is linked to the way we think. Maybe we could ground it in like 4E cognitive science and kind of what's happened in the study of cognition, maybe over the last, you know, whatever it is, 20 years or so, because it's a radical and for me very exciting theory that I think, you know, seems quite true, but it's also fairly new, like, you know, in terms of, you know, the history of cognition. So maybe you could give us like a kind of a rundown of that.
Hmm. Yes, I think that's where we're connected too, which is interesting because I know you talk about John Vervey a lot, for example, who a lot of people have told me I definitely need to read and need to watch his videos, and it's on the list. And I already have a lot of respect for him just from what I've heard from other people, but he comes at this 4E cognition in a similar way to me, but I'm coming at it through more. I think actually, if John and I were to talk, we're coming from the same place. I think he's read Evan Thompson and this whole Varela, and he's coming out of that tradition, cybernetics, and so on. But the point is that as someone who studied philosophy and has degrees in philosophy, you know, you learn that cognition is something like a computer in your brain. That was sort of the prevailing idea when I studied cognition, or when I studied philosophy and neuroscience. And it was almost just you take it for granted, and a lot of people still do that somehow our cognition, our mind is inside of our skull, and it's like a little computer, and there's a lot of theories connecting that. But in the 90s, and actually it goes back, you can trace this back to many people, the most ancient philosophers, but it began to be thought of as 4E cognition, as like its own sort of cognitive science in the 90s, with people basically saying, and I'm generalizing this, cognition's not in the head, it's in the body. It's a whole body experience. It's embodied is the word that a lot of people use. And then from that, you also get this idea. I was talking about tools, extension, so we can kind of extend our cognition through the tools we use, even if it's just a notebook. I write some things down, a list, and that helps me remember. So it's a little bit like I've put my memory, extended it into this tool, although it's of course only makes sense through my affordances and my body. So you start with the body, and then you have embedded and inactive, and some people put ecological in there. And I've always thought that emotion and feeling are part of that, which are tricky words, but there's a lot of different things that could go in there. But ecological, you know, it's more the immediacy of your surroundings. You're embedded to everything around you is orienting, parameterizing your cognition. And inactive is the participatory part. So you're not stuck in your body either. You're just like we're taking in air and we're taking in food. We're taking in the materials that do go into our cognition. And if you think of cognition as, this is kind of hard because even when people hear this, and all of you probably already know about it, but when you think of 4E and you think of cognition as in the body, we still tend to think of, oh, there's like a thing that's me, that's cognitive, and then it's inside a body, you know. And the more radical or ecological approach that I'm saying when I'm saying it's movement is, there's not a separation necessarily at all between what cognition is and what the body is doing. When I'm walking, it for me, and this is kind of a radical thing, but that's already what we end up later calling a cognitive act. We're making our way through something. And for me, thought, the kind of thought that we have that's image and language based or tagged, is also making its way through a certain sort of space in the same way we might walk through a space, in the same way we might build certain habits in that way. So this 4E cognition is very exciting because it gets us out of thinking of the brain as stuck in the head and as a computer. I still actually find a lot of wonderful things in that literature, by the way, that I don't think these are either or. A lot of people say you're a computational philosopher, you're analytic, or you're embracing 4E. And I think that's stuck in an old bifurcation that has been important, that we need to respect and hold. Don't need to get rid of it. and instead sort of explore the space around that. And for me, this movement that we're talking about allows us to do that. And also starting to understand the difference between the tools we make and the representations that we make, and this ongoing, never stopping cognition, process of cognition. A lot of computationalists try to look for in the brain these representations. And that's one thing about Fourier cognition that's very important for me, is it's saying we don't look for little hieroglyphs in the brain that somehow map onto a particular memory or thought. We start to think of it more as this ongoing process with these lines that extend to our birth, and maybe even further if you want to trace them. It's like a tree branching out, branching out, branching out. And the cognition we experience in this moment, whether it's the personal inner feeling like I have thoughts and this kind of very intimate memory, or whether it's the way we're literally finding our way, making our way through an environment. All of that for me is very connected to everything that's come before in our lives. And of course, everything that went into making our lives. And I think 4E is much closer to being able to hold that mystery and that magic than the computational theory of mind, which is also very exciting, but in a different way. It's exciting in a representational way, externally representational way for me. But I won't
Yeah,
go on and on.
absolutely. No, I love that. And there's a few things that come up for me. One of them is that I think a very important point is I've noticed this as I'm working on this documentary, because I've literally today and for the last week been working on a section with John Vervey talking about
Oh.
the journey we went on from the Bronze Age collapse into this kind of developing, I think it's Robert Bellah, sociologist, calls second order thinking, that we could abstract our thought, we could have arguments with people in our head, we could imagine a future that's not here right now, and then that leading to this big shift into a two-world mythology. Like, okay, there's the real world, which is beyond us, that we transcend to, and then there's this physical world which is full of suffering and grief, and we have to find a way out of. And I've been really chewing over this a lot in terms of cognition, and I noticed myself really falling into, I would say, the trap of thinking that it's either about abstraction or embodiment, and then the embodiment and connectedness with other people and feeling stuff and being able to like hold and grasp, like that's all good. And the weirdness of like TikTok and sort of video games and abstraction, that's all bad. And then as I've been working on this, I've realized, no, actually, I'm a writer. All I do is abstract, literally throwing symbols together to make abstract things in from my mind to then hopefully elicit a feeling or thought in someone else's mind. So it's a really beautiful, wonderful, incredible thing. And so there is some way in which I think we need to be holding, as you're speaking to, abstraction together with this kind of deeper, connected, embodied reality. And the other thing that came up for me as you were speaking was the thought that, when we talk about 4E cognitive science, we start metaphorically, it starts to sound a lot like what some indigenous cultures have said for a long time. I was thinking I'm just back from Australia recently, and I was thinking about Aboriginal song lines, just kind of like movement, narrative threads through the landscape, which are inseparable from the landscape as well. And then also in my culture, in Irish Celtic lore, there's sometimes talk of the soul being around the body, not inside the body. And we have this is very Christian idea of like inspiration, right? It's just this like the spirit coming through me, and it's all like spirit is like this thing that kind of goes into the body somehow, and you kind of fill the body with a spirit, and then it becomes alive. And when you die, the spirit sort of leaves the body. It's such a different conception if you imagine that the soul is surrounding the body all the time, and then the body dies, the soul maybe drifts and connects with other souls or whatever it might be. So I think there's all these really interesting crossovers in different cultural and mythological stories that maybe point us towards this more dynamic, interconnected form of cognition.
It's great you bring that up. What if we even think of consciousness or life? I mean, we could discuss what's really the difference between life and consciousness. And by consciousness, I don't mean our awareness of our consciousness. I don't mean self-consciousness or knowing that we're thinking. I just mean being the body being awake, conscious, alive. What if we think of all of this as similar to what you just said about the soul being, we're in the soul, but all of this we're immersed in this. We're like consciousness is this. And when I was saying that mind is a verb, mind is steering that in a way. And it's not that there's a thing sitting inside steering that. It's that consciousness is the activity of consciousness making its way is the steering. It is the mind, you know? And then when you look back to these things you just said, that's hard because you have to really don't think there's a little homunculus that's steering the consciousness. No, consciousness, the activity of consciousness is mind. It is the steering. There's no, it's an ecological, it's one, it's at one. Then when we look back at what you were just bringing up in your history and in a lot of history, in my hippocampus book, I talk about this because I'm going into sort of the history of navigational, how we found our way literally, right? Because we could talk about it, but the hippocampus is important for navigation and also for this thinking and memory. And so you have this beautiful example of how to hold this paradox, hold this abstraction and this reality that you're talking about. And you look back at the history of our navigation and the way people have used the stars to find their way, or the way they've used the land to find their way, or the way they use their own body as the way through a place, and the way for a long time that was our history, our body, our voice. We're sharing our voice with others. We're not even writing it down. This gets to the level of abstraction that we're at now, but maybe that's a difference to your first question is there's still a kind of abstraction because there's a language creation, and that's an external abstraction that a place we meet, like, we create these abstractions so we can meet there and communicate. That's the same we do with our technology. Language is that. But if you think about just people moving through their environment, finding their way, making their way, wherever you want to go, as far back in history, I think it's a similar process of how we might find our way through a book, how we might find our way through difficult ideas. And when I'm writing about navigation, you start to really feel it. If you can, it's hard, but if you can hold the paradox and let it be true that consciousness is steering without it being here is consciousness and here is steering, and we either define one by the other or there's some little creature that's doing something. No, it's just two different ways to look at the way we're moving through our lives. And that can be me back in whatever the beginning of humanity, trying to make my way through a very particular landscape and survive. Or it can be me here now trying to understand how to make my way through a philosophical problem and express it in a way that's going to open new paths. So I don't know if that really gets to your point, but I'm very interested in that you keep bringing up the abstraction, because I think that points to something that's really getting to the why it's urgent that we do start to think in a different way about these seeming dichotomies that you brought up, of where you're trying to either think of it as this or this. I feel like right now we're constantly making some kind of a choice, and we're starting to let our technology make the choices for us, which is what we've created out of our own past waymaking, our own past ways of making paths. But instead of making new paths, we're somehow giving over that steering capacity to our technology, which is going to numb. It's going to just it's going to numb us, I guess, or it's going to take away a lot of this wonderful, magical mystery that is being alive in consciousness. And I think we're doing it without knowing we're doing it. We don't understand that that the abstractions are different. The abstraction, in the sense of all of this thought, is different from the tool itself, and that we're steering that. And if we just give ourselves over to the technology we've created to help us better steer, we're sort of closing up the path in a way.
Yeah, that's quite profound, I think, because I think, holding both the abstraction and the connection at the same time feels like the way perhaps to navigate the times we're in more effectively, because there's really old wisdom in lots of different traditions, including psychotherapy and including Jung, where
Hmm.
the problem isn't abstraction, but the problem is when something becomes so abstracted from its source that it forgets its source. So it's like the problem isn't the egoic self. The problem is when the ego becomes untethered from the self and lost and
Mm.
isolated and alone, and then starts to mimic the values of the deeper self in a desperate attempt to reconnect but never can. And so there's that is seems to be a process that plays out in human beings over and over again. And then now we see it with potentially with AI, where we have, there's a book that came out last year called The AI Mirror by Shannon Valor, is a philosopher. And she has this, the point she's making is that, AI is similar to, I think, what you were naming there, perhaps, like AI is a mirror for everything we've already done. All the
Mm.
wayfinding we've already done is there,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have any capacity for the wayfinding of the future. Even if we ask it, where should we go now? It's going to base it on where we've been. And sure, we do that, but we have this capacity, which is uniquely human and different. Firstly, we're in the world. It's not in the world, which is, a whole other question of do we, should we, or do we need to put AI into individual robotic bodies for it to have truly a form of consciousness that's embedded in the world? I think the should there is probably a big question. But then there's also this question of that she raises in the book, where she points out, like, it's also the big danger of it is that we forget how to ask our own questions. And we forget actually how to figure out when we're standing on the precipice of a valley we've never been into before, to just go, I don't know, let's figure it out. And
Mm.
instead we double down into this sort of false oracle to say, which way should I go? And I already noticed that the way we're using AI is already becoming, because it's an extended cognition, we're already leaning on it, myself included. Although I don't use it for
Mm.
writing, I use it for, well, image video generation now for this documentary. It's like
Mm.
it, there's a heavy leaning into it, and it's so easy to forget what it really is and lose ourselves in that abstraction.
Yes, if we think of consciousness as steering, it's we're kind of giving over that, because you can be conscious without mind. You can just be present and conscious. But when you're trying to find your way through anything, you need some form of steering. It doesn't mean that, you know, and it's coming from all that experience. And that's what goes into something like a large language model. I mean, that's just language, but it's all those possible paths that everyone's done all, forever. And of course, it can recombine those in different ways and so on. But what we're kind of doing is giving our steering over to something that can recombine a lot of representations of a very rich multiplicity that isn't actually represented fully there. We're forgetting that that's a very small part of what actually goes into what we think of as making a choice or cognition. And so I can understand it. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful things about AI. I love technology, and I think we need it, but we also really need to realize that the life, the living, the consciousness, the possibility. Um, we just got started there, you know, and we don't want to start giving that over to this past little 5% of discovery and exploration that we've had about being what it is to be human, what it is to be conscious, what it is to be life, becoming aware of itself. All of that is richness that's not going into a large language model. What's going into the large language model is how we've talked about it. So I can understand we want to have an answer and just someone tell me where to go and tell me what's right. But the world is always changing, and this participatory sense making that we do with each other and with the world and with ourselves when we communicate with our own selves, that's a richness that we've only just started to understand what's possible there, and none of that possibility is going to be replicated in any of the large language models. It might tell us some new things, create some new beautiful new art and all of that, and that's wonderful. And it certainly can do a lot of helpful things. But when it really comes down to life, if we think of ourselves as part of life, of part of this wider life, we hardly even have started to understand that potential. And for me, that's a very different potential.
Yeah, beautifully said. And you know what's coming up for me in that is the desire I have, and maybe other people have, to get lost in a world that is completely mapped and is very hard to get
Mm,
lost in. And there's I ran a course a couple of years ago called New Ways of Knowing, and one of the exercises in it was to get lost. Just go out without your phone and just go into the
yeah.
city or the countryside, wherever you are, and get lost. And when I
Hmm.
did it for myself, I really enjoyed it. It was great
Mm.
because, of course, when then you switch on different aspects of your your awareness that you just were outsourcing to Google Maps or to whatever it was. And so, yeah, I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on getting lost and like the kind of the I don't know not the purpose of it, just like what it brings up, like what's good about getting lost.
Well, what's good about getting lost is you meet your edges and you realize there's something beyond them. And you also learn new connections. That's one thing I think someone wrote imagination. I just saw come up this word imagination. And I think that's a very important thing, and it's very connected to memory. And we can imagine new paths when we get into a situation where our habits are disrupted and where our old routines are disrupted. So getting lost for me is a bit about that. It's you've you're putting yourself in a position, hopefully where you're safe. I mean, we can do this in safe ways, right? That where you're gonna have to find your way without relying on those algorithms, those old routines. And I think we all have had that experience where that opens up some part of us or some new relationship or some capacity that we wouldn't have even known was there if we hadn't gotten lost, in the sense of put ourselves in a position of discomfort slightly, of not having the answers already, of having to be present. When we're lost, we have to be in our bodies and we have to be present. And of course, we don't want to go overboard with that because you can panic. The body can, become in a panic state. So we have to be gentle with ourselves. But something I've done lately is just try to go out and leave my phone or whatever behind and just not, go somewhere new, but of course I can find my way back if I really need to or whatever. But also feeling like, okay, I'm going to also believe in humans around me. If I need help, I will actually talk to people and ask them, where is the whatever? Because then again, it's that what you were saying about the abstraction. I think a lot of us, we feel safe now in a way that's a little bit of a trick. We feel safe if we don't have to interact because then we don't have to show ourselves. We don't have to show that we don't know something or that we're lost or that we're uncomfortable. But also then we're not putting ourselves in a position to be helped or to let others help us, which is such a rich, potent interface of evolution, of connection, of extending what's possible. I think we get into a mindset where we think we actually have seen everything and we know all the parts and everything's been mapped. No, not at all. We've mapped what we've been able to handle so far. There's a lot more. If we stop, then all we're going to get is what we've been able to handle so far. If we keep going, find ways to do it together that are safe enough, there's so much more possible. We can't know it right now because we haven't gotten to the edges. But getting lost helps us, I think, especially when we do it together, explore those edges in a safe way that then we move possible. What's possible, we move it forward or we move it into other dimensions. I don't like this linear as if we're moving ahead, but it's like, there's so many worlds around us right now. We are multiplicities and we are in multiplicities. And we can only handle what we've gotten to the point that we can handle. So we think we see everything, we think we've mapped everything, and I don't think we have it all. And I don't want us to start relying on the safety of where we've been via our technology, and forget that there's so much more possible, because I really believe there is. And I think I mean, I think people that's one thing with thinking psychedelically or doing uh, these kind of experiences, are also getting lost in a way and opening up and realizing, oh, what I thought was the parameters of my life are not. And we can do that through music, through books, through a lot of ways, but those are also ways of getting lost. And, important part of that also, though, is helping other people find their way and allowing people to help us find our way. I think that's an important part of getting lost too.
Beautiful. I mean, it's great. I love, I've been in the psychedelic field for like 20 years, and never once have I thought about that metaphor that you just brought up, that psychedelics are like getting lost. I'm like, oof, it's great. That's going in the Breaking Convention talk next week. No, it's really like, it's lovely. And there's as you were talking, there's something else was coming up for me, which is that yes, our technology does that, but also our technology has been designed. And there's a book or a couple of books by Sherry Turkle, who's a sociologist who studies our relationship with technology. One book is called Alone Together, I believe, and I think it's in that one. She talks about, she researched like, technologists at MIT and elsewhere, and one of the things she found is that a lot of them were themselves, because of being kind of socially awkward and not really enjoying human contact, looking to create what she called a friction-free emotional life, right?
Mm.
So they would create like apps where it would show you if coworkers were like at a cafe, so you didn't have to bump into them and have to have the conversation, right? So this is an example of like the hyper abstraction of like, all I want is information. I don't want any of the messy human stuff. But when you're
Mm.
lost and you ask people for directions, yes, you tap into the collective intelligence of the network of human beings, but you also connect with a living, breathing human whose experiences are so rich and layered that you might be asking for how to get to the train station, but then you end up making a friend for life, or you end up realizing, there's all this depth and layering. And I do, this is the question I want to end on before we go to our Q&A here in the Zoom, and we'll stop on the Substack. But the idea of how do we use our technology to enhance our connectedness, to kind of move towards that more integrated way of holding connection and abstraction together. I'm curious to hear your take on that.
Well, I think first it's realizing that the technology is an extension to help us explore and get lost and find our way, but it's not the space only to do that. So we don't need to go into the technology and explore, but think of the technology as a way to open up the life that we can explore. It's a kind of a different shift, right? I think right now we think we go into our technology and we explore the internet, or we explore people's profiles. And for me, what we need to realize is that we've gotten latched onto those optics and we think we're going into new worlds, but we are actually stopping ourselves. And if we can think through the technologies again, think of the technologies as ways to open new paths and ways to start to understand ourselves as multiplicities. I mean, there's some technologies that are so exciting for me, like that these virtual setups where you can sort of swap bodies, so to speak, where you can almost start to feel like another person. Those kind of ways of using technology, I think, are extraordinary. How wonderful it would be to feel what it's like to be your dog, or or to be a bat, to go to this old philosophical puzzle. When I think of how much we could do with technology in that sense of helping us understand what it's like to be on another path or in another position, I think technology is wonderful. But what we have to do is kind of detach ourselves from what I call the complexity of optics, which is that we're so fascinated with the optics, with the desired effect, you know? Facebook and Instagram and all of this is all about the desired effect. Like, create what you want other people to think you are. And now we live in those little worlds. And it's just like you brought up with the turtle, it's safer too. It feels safer. It's actually not, but And I think if we can understand that we've gotten caught in that complexity of optics, and it is a complexity, so there's infinite kind of ways you can look at it and explore it, and it seems rich, but actually, if we could open that back up, use that as portals into exploring life and exploring what's possible as ourselves, that we're connected with life in different ways, then technology can become, yeah, it's a wonderful thing. It is a wonderful thing. But getting away from the optics, which is connected to addiction and, all these things that a lot of our technology now runs on. And instead, I think of it as the complexity of love. I know love is a hard word for people, especially in science where I'm working. People don't want to talk about that word, but I really think it's important we bring that back, because in that embodiment too. And because I think our meaning is in this participatory sense making that can only be done when we understand ourselves as consciousness exploring what's possible, and the technology being a possible medium for extending that instead of a place to go and hide or escape or create some desired effect to, get impress people and get followers and all this. I think we need to move past that paradigm, not necessarily reject it, but see it for what it is. If you read Jonathan Haidt and these people, I think we see it's causing a lot of distress. It's clear. I think we can open the space now and hold it and say, this is wonderful. We're not using it in the way we need to be using it. What do we want to experience in our life and in our connection, and how can we orient our technology towards opening those paths?
Yeah, amen to that. I'm moving in a very similar to a very similar conclusion in that, in the sense of, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt, and then also there's just early signs of Gen Z and younger generations seeing the whole social media space and the chasing of likes and clout as just not very cool, because it's not very cool,
Yeah,
because
it's
it's
not.
desperate.
It's really
Right.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really not cool. And so that is encouraging to me. And I also think that, something I've been talking about for years, and was a big part of what we were doing in Rebel Wisdom, was like, we need to have difficult cultural and political conversations using well, in person firstly, or on Zoom also works if you use the right practices and techniques, if you stay connected to your body. It's kind of amazing. But that's also, for example, that's the internet, but it's the internet in a very different way. We're using the internet to facilitate connection the way you're describing. And I do wonder whether we're moving towards peak social media. Like, it'll take a
Mm.
while, I think, because there's a lot of inertia and there's a lot of like, sort of momentum. But I more and more think, just there's a general exhaustion with social media, not just with the effect it's having on young people, but just the sense, even me as a, someone creating content on Instagram and TikTok, I just kind of stopped doing it after a while, because I thought,
Yeah.
I just don't really like, I could just keep going and just build up followers, but it just felt very pointless. It was like, well,
Hmm.
I'll do it when I feel like there's a need for it. And I'll put out a video if I feel like, oh, that's interesting or it's contributing, but I could feel the machine gnawing away. It's just kind of more. And then, of course, as I'm also exploring this documentary, Yanis Varoufakis's notion of techno-feudalism is important, where actually, wait, who are we actually creating this content for?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, a small group of near trillionaires. So there's all those dynamics at play. And I think we're moving, and perhaps there's an early adoption of like, let's just get not offline, but let's get off social media, basically. Quite simply put, yeah.
Yeah. It's that steering. Let's realize we're setting up our future with the choices we make right now. And if we continue to support these kinds of infrastructures where what is cool or what is seen as cool, even if nobody actually, even if in your body it's not cool and it's not right to be participating in, for example, these negative social media worlds where you're trying to keep up with what can't possibly be kept up with. Yeah, that goes back to what we started with, getting into our body again and being gentle with each other and stop. I think we all judge each other and ourselves way too much now because we're so used to these optics and we think we have to live up to those. And I think if all of us look at our lives, the moments we want more of are the moments we we don't, it doesn't matter that much at all about optics. We're connected to something around us, if it's a tree or if it's a person or if it's a book or whatever it is. And we can make technology that supports more of that. It's just that right now we're so routed toward optics with our technology that we think there's no other way. But I think I agree with you. A lot of it's going to be people realizing they don't feel good. This is not a good place to be. And once you really sit with that a minute and you have maybe a couple friends or you even just have a book you can read about it, you can make a different decision. And it might mean that you're not, I think like you, I don't want to be on whatever, Twitter or social media because why would I want to spend my time doing that? Once you start realizing there's no end to that, at least as it is right now, it could change. It could be something else. The connection is wonderful, but we have to do it. We have to do it with our choice, the choices we make, what we orient towards. Someone said pro-social. I think that's a very good word. Switching the orientation. And we can do it. We can all do it like together.
Amen to that. Beautiful.
Hmm.
So great. We're gonna go into Q&A here on the Zoom, and thank you everyone for tuning in on Substack. We're gonna have Ian McGilchrist next week, and so if you want to be part of Ian McGilchrist Q&A and longer session, join up as a community member on Kainos. Thank you everyone, and we'll see you soon. And thank you, Andrea. This was great. Stay on though because we're gonna go into Q&A. So I'm just
Okay.
gonna end
Thanks,
this.
everybody.
Cool. Great. Now it's just us.
Okay.
So yeah, absolutely fascinating. So yeah, we've got a little bit of space now for Q&A. Leslie had to jump to another meeting, and Simon also had to hop off, might hop back on. So a little bit intimate, but all good. Anyone want to hop in? Thoughts, questions, comments?
I have an unformed question.
Those are the best kind.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, I'm just gonna lay down some pieces and maybe you can come up with a question. Optics, like having to do with eyes, and I think I don't know, I'm not that familiar with the Bible, but I think in the Bible it's like that sight is considered the only of the five senses that can be used to dominate. Uh, like you can see somebody without them being able to see you in a way. It's
Mhm.
like it's a single directional. Okay, so there's that with the word optics, and then there's haptics, which is
Mm.
right,
Mm.
like touch, right? So,
Mm.
but then there's also, okay, if you think about boundariness in terms of like building a wall, that's a lot different than thinking about boundariness in terms of a membrane. So, like, what is the languaging that we could use to shift our orientation to technology that includes biological terms? So like social tissue or something, or like, you know, or like, I don't know, it seems like from what you're saying that it could be helpful to, I mean, I'm a language nerd, I love words anyway, but just to like shift the orientation and the possibility with new languaging and maybe more body languaging
Mm.
helps. And then it also makes me think of in McGilchrist, he talks about the both and that completely includes the either or.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when you're talking about abstraction and embodiment, it's like they can exist as either ors distinctly or be considered as seemingly distinct components, let's say, and held in the both and um,
Mm.
as a whole and related in a
Yeah.
seeming way. Yeah.
Those are wonderful points. I mean, it makes me think of three things. One is the conversation I had with Ian McGilchrist. It's great you're going to talk to him again. I know we're both inspired by him and this left brain, right brain, but the real he and I talked about actually the reality is holding those both of those, and that both and that you're talking about. Also, I had a conversation with Alex Gomez Marin or Marin Gomez. I always say it wrong, but about this idea of seeing without the eyes. um, so and this haptics, it's great you brought that up. I always think that, you know, is there a way to talk about the whole body as being a sensory whole, not separating it into eyes and touch, and because like what you said, that we can sense each other without looking at each other, and it feels like we're seeing each other. We talk about it as seeing, but what's the word, as you brought up, what's the word that actually is a whole body sensation, right? It's almost like any of those five senses, whether people say there's like 30 now senses, but they actually kind of stand in for whole body, touch, you can feel everything in your whole body, or seeing, we feel like we're say see, but what we really mean is our whole body feeling something. So I have thought about that. Like, what's the word that, or even do we even want a word in technology? Maybe we want to think about it. Yeah. I mean, what is thinking psychedelically if we apply it to technology, Like what is having multiplicities of paths instead of binaries, like follow or like or not like. This is the way it's set up right now, but this whole body sensing seems to demand a technology and a social media that doesn't have these categories that you always must choose between. And that's the way all the technology is set up now. I don't know if you've thought about that,
Mm.
Alex, about.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I'm just sitting with the concept of that kind of psychedelic technology, because that was the original hope for the internet. It was very psychedelic, and the sense of a hypertext world where you click on one thing and it opens another, and then
Mm-hmm.
that is quite different from social media where you have an endless scroll that's been dictated to you. There was a sense of, I think, in the early internet, which most of us probably remember well, like, you kind of, even now you can go on like a Wikipedia journey and like click there, click there. And it's, it created a kind of postmodern fragmentation, or went hand in hand with sort of the postmodern ideas about there is no fundamental underlying truth. There's just hyperlinks everywhere. It's just kind of endless hyperlinks. And I don't agree with that necessarily. So I do wonder, a psychedelic approach would have some kind of foundational basis underneath it, so we didn't get lost in the kind of fragmentation. There would be a sense of perhaps connectedness, or a sense of rootedness of, yeah, what is this, like, to what you were saying before, that the internet doesn't become a thing we're like diving into and getting lost in, but is a thing that is, we're here, and then the internet is kind of between us in some way, or surrounding us, and we can use it to navigate. So yeah, I mean, it's like I could riff on this forever, but I want to invite Bradley to speak.
Um, Conversation is great. I love that we're shining lights on social media and technology, and just the almost inevitable entrainment of certain psychologies. But I do think like that orientation to optics, I think, is a real social or even cultural issue to address. But I wonder, like, I'm tempted to extend it to the games that we choose to play. Like, I think at least the synthesis that I find helpful to make sense of things is uh, we're we're implicitly playing all these games, and often we're not even sure that we've opted into them. So if perhaps it's fair to say that some of the dominant cultural games is, something along the lines of he who dies with the most stuff wins, or getting the most likes is like, that's what life's about. That's the goal, that's the mission. And I think and there's many more, number of publications or citations, or there's all these niches with different games, and I think in many cases they're bad games to be playing. They're adolescent games to be playing. And I think we're repetitively disappointed in the subjective results of playing those games, and it's almost a point of development where people wake up to that and decide that, hey, I don't like this anymore. I want to do something different, and it's good for a sense-making commons to point to this, identify this, and make something implicit phenomenology explicit for people. I think a lot of young folks, especially, but maybe the same could be said for most ages. The game that has been foisted upon us is this optics game, and I think pro social media, changing the algorithms, and there's a lot of great insights and ideas around how to do that, is a step in the right direction. I think a paradigm shift to deciding that this is a bad game might even be a more resilient solution. And if we make explicit kind of the that choice that we all have for our lives, I think that gives us that unsticks us from being subjected to the cultural sicknesses that like this late stage capitalist culture hurls at us.
Yeah, just
That's not
realizing it is
really-
a game too, right? I think a lot of us don't think of that we're playing that game. We don't think of it as in the way you just said, to just having that distance from it enough to realize, like, it's great you put the CT in there, because understanding it is a gamification, that social media world is a kind of a realization, isn't it? And you kind of have to have that before you can decide you don't want to play it, because a lot of, especially I think when we're really young, we just think that's where you have to make your way. You go into those worlds and you think you need to get followers, you need to get likes, you need, as if that's about your self-worth. And when you realize it's a game, it actually gives you a kind of distance from it, and you can say, do I want to play this? Yeah.
I'm excited to see you. So I put a book in there, Bradley, as you were talking. I probably mentioned it to you before, but the Games Agency as Art by now. I actually referenced this book in my book, and in the audiobook I had to pronounce his name many times. But how do you pronounce the name?
C.T. Nguyen.
Nguyen. Yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah, it's like I remember vivid.
Yeah, I had him on the show. I'd actually met him and asked him, how do I do it?
Great. Yeah, no, I'm curious because I'm a big fan of that book and like the
gamification.
Yeah,
he's wonderful. He's such a great writer.
Yeah, fantastic. And also there's the idea of this incredible insight that different art forms, capture different senses, and that games are about agency. And I think agency is such a major question in the online world. I mean, obviously it's a major question for all of us in life. It is life. But, in the online world, like, degrees of agency and how agency gets captured by the different games we have to play, I think is pretty fundamental. We've got another 10 minutes or so left. So let's, Nico, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I love the concept of game that Bradley brought up. It's like one of the main sort of psychedelic insights that I had. And I'm wondering, I guess, how do we start cultivating that from a young age, like prior to doing psychedelics, or just like from the teenage years. I mean, I'm 25 now, but my generation was definitely the one that got like hooked on social media. And if we think about what we're trying to achieve with likes and follows, it's quite pure. It's like a sense of belonging and that you're being loved. And so yeah, it's like a shift in values that needs to happen. And I always go back to education in the early years, and like how do we start building it from there. And I don't have any answers. It's more like, an intention.
I think it's so important that we for me, it comes to the realization and having the option, having this be in your life when you're a kid. It can come from your parents. It can come from, anyone. Just that statement of saying that you're not your thoughts, and you're not who you are on your social media feed. That's not who you are. That's you playing a game. Play it like a game, but realize it's a game. Don't understand it as yourself. It's not you. And I think what you said is powerful too. If we could, that's what we were talking. Like if you understand consciousness as something much bigger, and life itself as something much bigger and more potent than could ever be in any form of technology. If you start with that understanding, and you realize when you're going into technology, you're narrowing that. If we could understand that early on, that I think right now we feel like the opposite. We're going to go into these technologies to expand ourselves somehow. And kids feel like that's where they have to go to get their thrills or whatever. And it ends up being the addictive thrill, which, can lead to us trying to hold ourselves to things we could never be in the first place because they were always created as optics. So yeah, I mean, for me, when I think about my own life or when I think about kids, like it comes in the early years through education, but also just through having people around you who know that and say it to you, you know?
Yeah, I also feel like it goes against what you're talking about, holding paradox or holding complexity, which has been a huge theme on Kainos. Like social media doesn't really allow for complexity or for holding paradox, which I believe is one of the most essential paradigms to cultivate.
I think it's what so many of us, are trying to do in different ways. I think it's where the work Alex is doing and I connect. I think a lot of people, all the people we've named here are trying to find ways to expand what we understand as consciousness and thinking. You can use those words in all kinds of different ways, and it starts with holding those binaries. And then once you understand there's space around them and you start looking at the patterns, the binaries themselves, you start to realize have many other binaries. There's multiplicities there. But first you have to hold them and understand there's a space holding them that you can explore and get lost in to bring that back up. And then you start to realize, oh, if I turn this way, what looked like a binary is actually just some other kind of relation. And, like it becomes a more fractal, multidimensional understanding. And I think our technology can do that. Right now, it literally works on zeros and ones, and you literally take a choice, and the technology reflects that. But it doesn't have to be that way. We who knows if we get quantum computing in our lifetimes, but we could. But even if we don't, we can develop ways that think fractally, technologically. And I think we're trying to do that even maybe with a space like Substack. You see people getting angry when they try to start putting it into those binaries. They want a place that's free and open to explore.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I do think I think it's probably coming because I think there's an evolutionary thrust towards that. And I wonder about like the intellectual journey in the West, at least over the last maybe 30 years into sort of post-structuralism and post-modernity. And we're kind of deconstructing everything, including binaries, very specifically binaries. And then, as you're pointing out, like if you do that, you can't hold the very thing you need to hold to see the thing they're talking to, which is this kind of complexity and this fragment and this kind of relativism. So yeah,
and we end up fighting, right? Trying to
Yes.
solve one binary by the other, or like to reference your work, trying to kill the ego or something instead of hold it and or hold life and death. And even in philosophy, I see it where we fight about, oh, it's idealism, no, it's physicalism, no. It's like we're always trying to smush one binary into another.
Yeah,
And
definitely,
yeah,
definitely.
it's an ongoing, unending war.
Yeah. So here's to stepping into new territory, to quote the wonderful Trish Blaine, who's on this call. Andrea, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating, and I'm really glad to have found your work as well, because there's so much crossover. We've got to get you in conversation with John Vervey as well. Maybe I can facilitate that if you're up
That
for
would be
it.
great.
I just think I just would like to be a fly on the wall in that conversation as well.
I've never had someone tell me so many times that I should talk to somebody. I swear, every day somebody says, you should talk to John Vervey.
Yeah. We'll try and make that happen. So amazing. Great. Well, thank you. And hopefully see you soon.
Thank you too. And it's wonderful. You have such a great community, and thanks to everyone. And thanks for the work you're doing and helping us hold Paradox.
Likewise. All right. Ciao.
All right. Bye.
Much. Bye.
Bye, everybody.